Hello, welcome to Magic Circles in the Skies podcast and today's episode. But before we begin, I'd like to give thanks to all the people that have liked, shared, and subscribed. This is very much appreciated and it helps to support the channel. Now for today's episode, which is called Eve's Various Children by the Brother Grimms, which I've renamed as Eve's Backhanded Slap at Favouritism. The structure will remain the same, starting off with a brief summary where I'll digress in a few highlighted sentences, give an interpretation or reflection, and my pearls of wisdom. Then we'll move on to my critical review on how I see this fairy tale plays in today's society, giving a compare and contrast with a film that shows the relevance of this fairy tale in today's society. And then we'll have the trigger points, which takes a look at some of the real life events that triggered me from this fairy tale. And we'll end with my quote. Now let's begin with today's episode, Eve's Various Children, or Eve's Backhanded Slap at Favoritism. The prologue. When Adam and Eve were driven out of paradise, they were compelled to build a house for themselves on unfruitful ground and eat their bread in the sweat of their brow. I digress. The punishment for allowing the seed of doubt to distrust God's advice felt like a heavy weight to endure. Adam dug up the ground and Eve spun. I digress. I wonder if Eve doubted her love for Adam after they were banished from the garden. The original sin was eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which was going against God's will. But didn't Adam eat the fruit from the tree and not Eve? Interpretation. The tale provides a unique explanation for the existence of supernatural creatures like elves, goblins, and fairies by connecting their origins to Adam and Eve and the life they form after being banished from the Garden of Eden. Their offspring are a reflection on the consequence of who Eve has become after her initial sin. The children Eve bears hold a mirror up to her that she dares not recognize as true. Therefore, she shamefully hides her ugly children while proudly presenting the beautiful ones to the world. I have linked folklore, its traditions, and the mythology and biblical historical events to support the foretelling of this story. My pearls of wisdom. God gave them Adam and Eve, but did God forgave Adam and Eve, but did Eve accept God's forgiveness of her actions in the garden? However, the deepest question is, did she forgive herself? I have discovered if we refuse to forgive ourselves, we fail to experience the promise of freedom God offered us through the act of forgiveness. If not, we tend to perpetuate a pattern of imposing self punishment when there is no need to. Summary. Every year, Eve brought a child into the world. I digress. I guess this was a normal procedure since there was no use of birth control at that time. For centuries, women had no choice but to give birth to children, whether they wanted to or not. However, Eve's children were unlike each other. Some were pretty and some were ugly. I digress. Maybe the beauty and the considered ugly children are a direct reflection of the dichotomy she feels about herself inside. After a considerable time had gone by, God sent an angel to them to announce that he was coming to inspect their household. I digress. God suspects a hint of shame and dishonesty portrayed in on Eve's part. Interpretation. So what I'm suggesting is that Eve hides the ugly children because she hasn't forgiven herself for distrusting God. The lure of the serpent had tricked them into the space of uncertainty. So Adam ate from the tree in which God forbade them. This is profound because on the surface she hides the children from God because she is afraid of his disapproval. But on a deeper psychological level, she is hiding them because they are a walking, talking manifestation of her own shame. They are a living reminder of her own perceived unworthiness. She cannot bear to look at the cold, harsh recognition of what she sees reflected in the eyes of her children. Pearls of wisdom. Power is a precious tool that needs to be used wisely. This comes back to the core of the unintentional sin. By taking power into their own hands and believing the serpent disguised as the devil. Could this be a misuse of power? The story begins with God visiting Eve and asking to see all her children. I digress. She must have gone to extreme lengths to maintain a facade of polished performance. Eve, however, only presents her beautiful and well groomed children, hiding her less attractive and ungainly children out of plain sight. I digress. The shame Eve feels about her less attractive children can be read as a lingering echo of the original sin and the guilt associated back in the Garden of Eden. God being all knowing, I digress. You cannot hide from God. Spirit is aware of the hidden children and asks Eve if she has any more children. I digress. The seed of deceit has already casted its web. When Eve denies this, God declares that since she chose to hide them, they will remain hidden from her and other humans as a punishment for her dishonesty. I digress. God essentially asserts divine authority in such a way that Eve cannot override it. Hence, the children are transformed into supernatural beings endowed with powers far beyond anyone's control or manipulation. I digress. Metaphorically, it shows that parents cannot fully dictate their children's destiny or worth. Even attempts to hide or control them can't be undone, can be undone by forces beyond human reach. Well done, Spirit. This comes back as a part of the initial core of sin, the devil's work, complicit with Adam and Eve's self doubt. Interpretation. If Eve is trapped in a cycle of self-condemnation, the central theme of Eve's various children is the importance of honesty and the consequences of dishonesty, as well as accepting and loving all children, regardless of their appearance or abilities. By hiding her less attractive children, Eve shows a lack of love and acceptance of them. The story suggests that all children, regardless of their differences, deserve love and care, and that discrimination can lead to negative consequences. I suspect Eve was unable to reconcile with the need to accept and forgive herself, which spilled over into a lack of unconditional love for all concerned. Eve and the cultural guilt. my perception. In the story of the Garden of Eden, Eve is historically portrayed as the first sinner, blamed for Adam eating the forbidden fruit. Over centuries, this story has been interpreted and often weaponized through patriarchal and sexist lenses of religion. Women were held responsible for temptation, disobedience, or original sin. This is a clear example of society imposed guilt. Generations of cultural messaging teach that women are inherently responsible for moral failure or for corrupting others is so not true. I believe she internalized this cultural guilt and took the weight of Adam's responsibility as well as hers. Pearls of wisdom. Eve's projection of God's assumed judgment and suspected disgust of her hidden children is yet misguided idea from her unworthiness. As a result, the hidden children become various supernatural heroes, which is the direct opposite of who she is. I digress. The children are turned into unseen spiritual forces she can never possess, even though she gave birth to them. She has no rights. The beautiful children that Eve presented to God go on to populate the earth as human beings. I digress. I wonder if Eve ever missed her permanently hidden children. I digress. I think this fairy tale warns us against showing favoritism of children and the ramification it has on family and society. In conclusion, interpretation, Eve's various children offers a story conveying moral lessons about honesty, acceptance, and integrity, which means doing the right thing. Besides, Eve uses her maternal power not to advocate for all her children, but to judge, hide, and reject those she deems ugly. She makes a unilateral decision about who is worthy of blessings, playing God herself, which we all like to do sometimes, I'm sure. The consequence, God denies Eve of having the power to control the destiny of her ugly children. By bestowing by bestowing them with supernatural beings with enormous potential. I'm reminded of the line from the film in Green Fried Tomatoes that special needs children or people that are considered children that are considered ugly are God's extra special children simply because of the pain they go through in society. This is never alluded to in the actual story. Adam's passivity. I want to point out that Adam is portrayed as almost passive, which he isn't. He eats after Eve offers him the fruit. The story subtly erases his responsibility, which is another layer of societal bias and sexism. The narrative has historically been used to shape expectations about gender and blame rather than objective moral truth. Pearls of wisdom. The real backhanded slap is the story itself delivering a stinging critique about the very notion of favoritism and how it creates a hierarchy through historical events and his institutions, a false sense of superiority, hence the golden child theory where one child is favored over the rest, while enormous pressure is put on them and not love. My critical review on how this fairy tale plays into today's society. In approaching this fairy tale, I felt a knot in the pit of my stomach, which I tried to avoid. I decided to search for a far less intriguing narrative that didn't hit so deep into my underbelly quite as much. But upon reflection, that pain was an indicator there were issues and revelations that needed to be addressed. The various children of Eve, although a folk tale dipped in tradition, I found myself being drawn to the biblical event expressed with Eve's shame and guilt, which echoes through the fairy tale. How Eve feels about her less attractive children and the shame that follows her children can be read as a lingering reminder of the original sin and guilt associated back in the garden. The story doesn't just classify the children by beauty, it ties their traits to moral and spiritual consequences, suggesting that human imperfections and struggles are inherited or at least shadowed by past transgressions. Isn't that what we still do today in different fractions of society and culture? It's a darker undercurrent than many of the Grimm's tales. It's not just a story about fairness or societal roles, but about the moral and spiritual weight carried by both parents and child. The less attractive children symbolize the lingering effects of human fallibility. Some are cursed with hardship, humility, or obscurity, while others inherit blessings and prominence. This draws me back to when I was a child and there was the awful fake smell of projected favoritism just to manipulate and control my sister and I. My parents were going through a divorce, so we had become the desired weapons of their choice to justify the fake appearance of taking each child protectively under their wings when we were just a pawn in their game. From a psychological perspective, it's also a reminder of the shame and the self-consciousness parents, especially mothers, can project onto their children based on their own perceived failures. The story really holds a mirror up to the human guilt, inheritance of sin, and the societal judgments that follow. I find myself reflecting on a true story I was involved in many years ago. I used to practice Buddhism and I became a district leader to a young woman who was in her 20s. She had a famous brother who was a Latin jazz musician, a sister who was a beauty pageant, and there was Harriet, nice looking, with black hair that framed her face, with a heart of gold, just aching to do good in the hope of disguising her special needs and mental disability. Her parents were embarrassed by Harriet, so tried to politely push her into the background and place her into a space of obscurity in plain sight. Well, one evening I called her home to invite her to a meeting. Her mother answered the phone and said she'd get her. Then someone asked me who Harriet is, so I just went on to describe her and said that she's the woman who's a little retarded, which I realize now was technically used as a slur to describe someone as foolish. She most definitely wasn't foolish, which I realize now I didn't know how to describe her mental disability. So it came out badly. Well, her mother heard this and forbade her from coming to the meetings for a while, which I understand. Or when I heard what happened, I felt so awful. But I received an interesting form of information. This person said the reason the parents were so offended is that I had touched a very sensitive nerve. Prior to me saying this, They were referring to her as this retard behind the scenes and hiding her as much as they could. I was told I revealed what the parents needed to acknowledge but wouldn't. She wasn't foolish. She was born with a neurological condition that her parents refused to recognize until my unfortunate utterance. A couple months later, her successful brother decided to move her to Miami, Florida, and begin life anew. He brought her into the light, which is where she always belonged, loved, recognized, and free to become the person she was supposed to be. Now let's go on to the compare and contrast using the film. I'm going to use the film The Royal Tenderbums from 2001 versus Eve's backhanded slap at favoritism. Now, in the Royal Tenderbums, children are treated unequally by their talents and achievements. You know, somebody's very good at literature or somebody's very good at sports, and they decide who is perceived as more favored based on these particular criteria. Dynamics, echoing Eve's selective pride in her beautiful children. The darkly comic, sharply observant tone of the Royal Tenderbums meshes beautifully with the Grimes story. Here's a contrast so we can see the various differences. Eve's various children. Eve shows shame towards some children and favors the beautiful ones. In the Royals, the favoritism to children is based on achievement. The contrast is both stories highlight the psychological impact of parental favoritism, how children internalize it. The Tenderbums, the favoritism is more subtle and socially performative, whereas Eve's is moral and spiritual in tone. Hidden and visible children, the traits. Hidden and undervalued children gain supernatural or divinely ordained roles, revealing their worth beyond Eve's control. In the Royals, children eventually reclaim agency and individuality independent of their parents' validations. Thank goodness. Contrast. The message aligns with worth exists outside parental favoritism. The difference is tonal. Grimm's tale is allegoric and spiritual, whereas the Tenderbums is ironic, human, and emotionally complex. Consequences and favoritism. Consequences of favoritism. And I'll just read the contrast. Both stories explore the favoritism, distorts perception and opportunity. But while Eve's Tale introduces supernatural justice, the film remains grounded in psychological realism and humor. And the last one is empowerment and redemption. The message aligns with the value that exists outside the parental favoritism and the children actually accumulating their self-worth without the projection of their own parents' self-worth onto them. So that's the great point of this. Now, my trigger points. Now, of course, in this story, um, biblical, historical foretelling, I found myself, really triggered because of the weight of responsibility of when you're a favorite and when you're not a favorite. I wasn't necessarily the favorite in the family, but I did all I did was give my mother gave birth to me. That's all. I came into the world and I was horribly judged as a failure because I didn't save the marriage. And so I can understand what it's like to be, considered the poison ivy of the family, which is called the black sheep of the family. So that's why it triggered me. And also the fact that Eve didn't commit the sin. She really didn't commit the sin. It was Adam that really ate from the tree. And yet she had to bear the weight and the guilt and the societal guilt and institutional guilt and religious guilt for her life. So I'd like to talk about a dressage athlete. I think I can say it that way. He's an equestrian, and he was in the Special Olympics 2012, but I think he's won a couple of 20 Special Olympics gold medals. Dressage is extremely difficult when you're on that horse and the horse is executing very difficult, technical, rhythmical exercises. And you have to be very, very good on that horse and be very strong and graceful and in good shape. Well, this man was born very deformed in his legs. And it was so bad that the hospital put him in a broom closet in a place where you store cleaning equipment and brought the mother to this closet and showed her son. And she said, "Why did you put him in a closet? He's my son." And she picked him up. She says, "I'm going to love him for the rest of his life. He's my son." And she of course, wasn't happy with the hospital and how they treated him. But he went on, he worked very hard, and dressage is really good for people that have a disability in their body because it forces you to really have a straight, erect back and take the weight off of your legs. They still had to wrap his left legs in plastic to keep his legs straight, but he went on to be extremely successful. And the last part, which is a really good trigger point, at the church that I go to, there's this one child. He's about 6 years old. He's a black boy. He suffers from is autism. He's special needs, and a lot of times he's in the area that where I sit at the church. I sit in the overflow room because I always leave early after the sermon. And he's been there a couple of times, and he tends to make quite a bit of noise. And I can really see how it's a struggle for his mother, even though his mother loves him like nobody's business. She absolutely adores him. And yesterday, he was there, and they came to sit on the sofa where I sit at the very back of the overflow room. And he was jumping up and down, and this was just before the sermon started. Well, there was a nice lady sitting behind him, a young woman, and she was kind of playing with him and showing the phone. And he really got on very well with her. And some people were looking at me as if to say, are you going to be all right? Because he's going to be jumping up and down. And there was this elderly woman sitting next to me. Not that I'm really young, but she was quite older than me. And the woman said, are you going to be all right? Because he likes to jump up and down. And she said, no, no, it's okay. And you know what was interesting? The sermon was about being distracted. And of course, he must be a distraction for his mother all the time because she's always trying to split her attention. And he spent almost that whole sermon, just like us, just resting, just very, very quiet and just listening to what he could listen to and understand. Because, people that have autism, it doesn't mean that they're not intelligent. They just have a neurological, chemical in their minds, in their body. It's not a chemical imbalance. It's a disability. Anyway, he was so great and just calm. And I saw the mother. She was just resting in peace and she was just so calm and she wasn't sleeping. She was just resting and was absorbing the sermon. It was a wonderful moment. And afterwards, as I was leaving, I asked for Anna Marie, and they said she's not around. And so I said, yeah, the boy there with his mother. She said, yes, he's the one that's autistic. I said he was absolutely beautiful, just so calm and lovely. It's not going to happen every week, but it was just so nice to see him in a peaceful place, even though I didn't say that to them. But even though I'm thinking now he has a disability, but he was at peace. It was absolutely beautiful. And it was a treasured moment for me. It's just such a special moment, such a blessing to see him in his various forms. Anyway, this is the end of today's episode. And I'd just like to say healing is a lifelong blessing, lesson, and gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Healing is a blessing, gift, and lifelong blessing, gift, and lesson we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Until next time, goodbye.